Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And now it's time for another Top 10. The Top 10 Best Hit Songs of 1967. So okay, when I added the top tier option on Patreon, I was expecting that certain years would attract a fair bit more attention than others. Presumably the more recent ones, if only to flesh out other years in this 2010s decade that I might have missed. Or maybe years that have achieved fame or notoriety for being the best and worst in music history, especially on the Billboard Hot 100. And thus, I shouldn't be all that surprised that a patron chose this year of all things. After all, from about 1964 to 1969, it's been considered by many music historians as a glorious age for popular music. The founding of psychedelic pop and rock, the expansion and growth of soul, the genesis of garage rock and proto-punk, and even birthing tones that would inspire funk into the 70s. And 1967 was smack dab in the middle of all of it, and this is where I need to step in and provide some context, because for as much as all of that is true about this era, in looking at what's popular, the sheen of baby boomer nostalgia in music history begins to fade a little bit. Because while 1967 was a pretty damn great year for the Hot 100, I could easily make a top 30 of this list and still make some painful cuts. I wouldn't quite qualify it as one of the all-time best. Close, but not all the way there, especially if you're making a comparison to either 1966 or 1968. Yeah, watching psychedelic rock take shape is pretty awesome, and there are loads of classics here. And I was actually a little bit stunned at how much terrific soul, jazz, and very early funk managed to slip onto the charts. But you know what? This is also the 1960s, and the tropes that plagued that era, especially in its earlier years, they are still visible. Yeah, we got the Beatles, the Summer of Love, and all the bands jacking their sound 2 years late, or dumbing it down to flaccid hippie pablum. Yes, black music was producing terrific albums that would be ignored and then later celebrated, and white artists were nakedly ripping them off for crossover success. And of course, you got the sorts of inane novelty crap and tepid pop and doo-wop leftovers that can flesh out a list of mediocre to outright awful songs, an era where parody tracks or blatant throwbacks could still chart as artists fought against the rapidly changing times. But thankfully, after going through all 100 songs that charted in this year and made this year-end list, we're focusing on the positive this time, and are subsequently facing a very new challenge. See, rock historians have been over the 1960s time and time again to canonize so many acts that if my choices will buck the popular consensus, and spoilers, some of them will, or if certain songs are left off this list, there'll be folks who'll cry foul that certain legendary songs are not represented. And let me make this abundantly clear. I'm not speaking for the institution of rock history, partially because I'm decades removed from ever living that history. This was music that was made when my parents were kids, but also because as that rock history has proven increasingly selective over the years, maybe a fresh set of eyes can recontextualize some of this a little bit. So, as always, the song had to debut on the Hot 100 in 1967, and let's get started with number 10. What's interesting about psychedelic music is that you can almost chart when it starts curdling into something much nastier, where the flower power starts transitioning into active or violent social unrest, or when the drugs really start kicking in. And while in 1967 you did have the Summer of Love, if you dig a little deeper into the bands that time forgot, the ugliness just around the corner.
I had too much to drink last night. Too much to drink. I'm not ready to face the light. I had too much to drink last night.
So it's always a little bit weird putting a band that I can guarantee the vast majority of you will have never heard of on a list like this, especially if you know anything more about the Electric Prunes, an American psychedelic and garage rock group that hit the uneasy balance of being too experimental and weird for most listeners, and yet barely responsible for most of the hits they did have. Most of the success behind this particular tune can be attributed to David Hassinger, a producer and engineer who did a ton of work with the Rolling Stones, the Grateful Dead, and frankly a disturbing number of huge acts in the 60s and 70s. Now, the Electric Prunes, they were his pet project. But despite the band's desire to experiment with some weirder tones and guitar tunings, Hassinger brought in professional songwriters Nancy Mance and Annette Tucker to provide them the halfway decent song that might become a hit. They were more of a label creation, just to say that. And you know what? It's a damn great song they got. Perhaps abusing the guitar vibrato a little bit too much, but it played off the seedy bass line, the mournful horns, and the wilder vocals more effectively, especially with the writing to capture that surreal, real intoxicating presence. Shame the Electric Prunes could never really follow it up, with most of the band leaving when, at the suggestion of their manager, they thought they would get commercial success by recording 2 albums of religious-inspired mass music in 1968, and despite numerous attempts to revive things, they never really were able to recapture this flower child nightmare of a song. But you know what? In terms of what was to come, this Acid Hangover was prescient indeed, and it's a pretty kick-ass song to boot. Number 9. And speaking of psychedelia that took an acid-tinged turn for the dark,
and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall.
So when Grace Slick left her previous band, The Great Society, she took 2 songs with her to join Jefferson Airplane, and they both turned out to be hits for them in 1967. And though she probably didn't know it at that time, her acerbic and fiery juxtaposition of Alice in Wonderland with drug culture was just dark enough to foretell the instability that would be coming in later years. And yet, as much as White Rabbit has been celebrated by music historians, it's still a little bit amazing how transgressive it was, even at the time. Not only smuggling its drug references past radio censors in the 1960s, but pointing a finger at parents and squares baffled why anybody would use drugs, even as the Psychedelic Foundation was in some of the children's stories. But even then, despite remixes that would give the song a slightly more conventional structure, White Rabbit, it defies an easy rock framework. A single extended crescendo that piles on layers of madness with its lockstep snare drums, the creeping bass, the lurking Spanish influence, and the sly feminist subtext in that third verse, with no real hook behind the song. And yet, for many, this would hold up as one of the classics of the 1960s, and for damn good reason. Even today, it's something special. Number 8. So as I stated at the beginning of this list, it was an ugly truth of this era that white artists could often get away with nakedly stealing from black artists and black culture. This is historical fact. This is not me going SJW here. There are many acclaimed artists from Elvis Presley to Led Zeppelin who built their careers on it, and it's one of the most complicated elements of examining rock music of this era nowadays. Now, for modern music critics looking back on this conversation, it tends to get a little bit simpler. When many white artists stole from Motown and Stax, they did so by making the music limp, flaccid, gutless, and insipid. And there was no way in hell any of that was gonna make this list, with one exception. So yeah, let's address the controversy first. The Spencer Davis Group was a short-lived UK rock group by the mid-60s comprised of the titular guy and the brothers Steve and Muff Winwood, the latter who would go on to be part of Traffic and Blind Faith and wind up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But in 1967, they were still struggling for any sort of follow-up hit, and thus they hit upon a bass line originally written by Homer Banks, a singer-songwriter for Stax in Memphis who would go on to write a number of hits in the 1970s. Now, his original song was called Ain't That a Lot of Love, which would go on to be covered by pretty much everybody from Sam and Dave to The Band to Simply Red to Tom Jones. And you know what? As a soul song with big horns and a solid groove, it's pretty damn good. And yet, Gimme Some Lovin' is a damn classic by taking that foundational groove, throwing a massive organ line on top of it, and ratcheting it up for a much looser vibe, emphasized by Spencer Davis's utterly wild vocals, the slightly quicker tempo, and more ruckus backing vocals. The song has a ton of energy and groove to it. I dare say it might even be better than the original, which always felt a little bit stodgy in comparison to this desperate slapdash bit of magic, and yet, even acknowledging that kind of feels awkward, especially given that this did wind up in court 2 years ago, and they actually ruled in favor of the Spencer Davis Group, as there was no clear evidence that they could have possibly heard the original, which, given distribution timing in the UK, was very possible. They might not have gotten that record from Memphis yet. In any case, between the hearsay and the copyright allegations and the ugly historical context of the whole matter, both songs are pretty damn great. And given what made onto this list, I'm happy to put Gimme Some Lovin' here just the same. But seriously, check out Homer Banks. Some of his stuff really damn good. Number 7. So yeah, that was a lot of heavy stuff for a list of the best hit songs of any year. So let's transition to a much lighter subject. Suicide in rural America.
And then she said, I got some news this morning.
from Choctaw Ridge. Today, Billy Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
So this is one of those tunes that never seems to get that much attention among the great singer-songwriter stories of the era, especially in the 1960s, even despite being the third biggest song of 1967 and even inspiring a movie in 1976. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to this, most of them bullshit products of the same rock and country establishment that has canonized many of her contemporaries. Bobbie Gentry was a woman who wrote and produced all of her own material in the 1960s and wrote some challenging songs with loaded subtext, including the song Fancy that Reba McEntire would later turn to one of her biggest hits. And while, in retrospect, critics adored her work as ahead of its time, that didn't exactly help her commercially in the era between Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, when the music industry just wasn't sure how to handle her, be they in Nashville or LA. And yet, for a brief second, this sparse, acoustic, yet strangely gorgeous ode to Billie Joe captivated America, going to #1 with all of its loaded questions of why Billie Joe committed suicide, and what was he and that narrator throwing off that same bridge the day before? And Bobbie Gentry has smartly never given a direct answer to either of these questions, describing how the fact that there isn't an answer is part of the point, instead speaking to small town nonchalance and an inability to engage with the grief underneath all of their noses, the real trauma here, in the fear of disrupting their cozy little world, even as that final verse, the world is getting all the more bleaker and changing beneath them. Now, this for the record does run slightly in contrast to the movie, where Billie Joe's suicide was tied to his emerging homosexuality and has sparked some queer literature in its examination of gay suicides in rural America. And again, this was in the 60s and 70s, decades before it gets better. And yet in the end, Bobbie Gentry has slipped out of many histories, even to the point where there was a documentary narrated by Roseanne Cash called Whatever Happened to Bobbie Gentry. Well folks, here's my recommendation for you. Go dig up Bobbie Gentry's first 5 albums, including the one she cut with the late Glenn Campbell. It's excellent. They're all fantastic albums, definitely worth your time, and this song, maybe all the more so. #6. So as I said very early on, for as much as 1967 was characterized by the summer of love, it wasn't all sunshine and lollipops and roses and rainbows. The more turbulent undercurrents of the 1960s were gaining more groundswell in popular music with every passing year, and the hippie congregations around the Sunset Strip in Hollywood were starting to get kind of unruly, so the city decided to impose a curfew or rename or close down a couple of the more ruckus clubs, which led to protests and demonstrations around Pandora's Box. The clubs had to be demolished. Demonstrations that led to a police crackdown that saw arrests for younger celebrities such as Peter Fonda and even Jack Nicholson, and led to the house band for a nearby club called Whiskey A Go-Go to write a little song that made this list.
Stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
You know, the funny thing about For What It's Worth is that Stephen Stills, yes, soon to be of Crosby, Stills and Nash, didn't even consider this a protest song, playing off the lingering electric tones and the brittle acoustic line with harmonies from a band that included a young Neil Young. It's more observational, seeing the turbulence from so many voices outside and the breakdown of any civilized debate and order, especially with the police crackdown that was just around the corner that Stephen Stills could plainly see. And it all comes as an instantly recognizable hook with the warning that's pretty heavy in the subtext. Look what's going down, kids, because you're gonna have to take a side eventually. And while Stephen Stills intended it more to canonize the closure of Pandora's Box, to his bemusement, it would become one of the most instantly recognizable protest songs of this era, not aging nearly as badly as so many of its contemporaries, likely because of that wary distance from the subject matter. A cautious warning to some, but a call to arms by so many others. Now, Buffalo Springfield might not have lasted. The band would put out 3 critically adored albums in 3 years before going on to much bigger things, as you can tell from the annals of rock history. But in a twisted way, this song proves all the more relevant all the damn time. Powerful stuff. Definitely earns a spot on this list. #5. life. So one thing that I've realized by putting together this list is that the more I've seen of what's been canonized by rock critics of this era, the less I've cared for them. I mean, there's gonna be some critical consensus, sure. The last 4 songs on this list also made Rolling Stone's 500 best songs of all time, that list that constantly changes, as will the top 4 on this list. But the exclusion of this track makes less and less sense with every single listen. I mean, it's Marvin Gaye, and Tammy Terrell can't exactly go wrong with it.
Oh, baby, there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, baby.
And the funny thing, this wasn't even their biggest song in 1967. Your Precious Love was even bigger, and you could argue that Diana Ross would do more to make this track famous 3 years later than her cover, but you know what? I've always loved the duet version of this song so much more. The terrific bass groove, the swell of the lush arranged strings after the first hook, the amazingly well-balanced percussion, and the interplay between Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell was just top-notch, even before that key change. And sure, it's a simple love song, but the give and take between both artists gave it such great magnetism, it was impossible not to get sucked into the vibe between Gaye's richer soul and Terrell's just raw sultriness. Now sadly, it was not a partnership that would last. That very year, Tammy Terrell would collapse on stage and pass away from a brain tumor only a few years later at the age of 24, a somber event that would color Marvin Gaye's work for the next several years, including the 1971 classic album What's Going On. But you know what? For a sparkling moment, we have a classic. No matter what Rolling Stone deigns to say. Number 4. So I have already highlighted a few forgotten artists going through this list, and this one, he might be one of the biggest. He was a close friend of Elvis Presley, and has been cited as an inspiration by James Brown and Michael Jackson, the latter who would dedicate his Grammy win for Thriller to him. The founder of Motown, Berry Gordy, called him the greatest singer he had ever heard, and 4 years ago, his name would become a reference to my top song of 2014. A legend of the late 50s and the early 60s who led the sort of tragic life that should have already been canonized in film already, who might have suffered a minor career slump in the middle of this decade but was in the midst of a comeback that would result in this classic little song.
You know your love keep on lifting higher, higher and higher. I said your love keep on lifting higher and higher.
So here's something you probably don't know. I've been a fan of the late Jackie Wilson for years. The sort of underrated soul legend that deserves to be rediscovered so many times over for his huge, raw vocal timbre and absolutely infectious presence. Say nothing of a stunning falsetto. And let's not mince words. He makes Higher and Higher the summer classic that it is. Repurposed from a soul ballad into something with huge energy, a big bouncy groove, lush strings, and terrific horns. And it's rare you get a song elevated by the strength of the showman alone, but Jackie Wilson, he could do that. His presence was that potent, that magnetic, that electric. And what I love about this song is that jittery sense of energy. It could have been played with a lot more languid poise, like that god-awful cover from Rita Coolidge in the late 70s, but Jackie Wilson knew how to capture that butterflies in the stomach feeling of love taking you beyond your expectations. It had to be fast, tight, and yet amazingly organic all the same. It's a soul classic that deserves all the accolades it has rightly gotten, even posthumously, and really, Jackie Wilson deserves so much more attention. Number 3. So as I said, when Grace Slick left the Great Society, she took 2 songs with her to Jefferson Airplane, and they both became hits. White Rabbit was one, this is the other.
Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Don't you like somebody to love? You gotta find somebody to love.
You know, the funny thing about Somebody to Love is that I think some people miss some of the teeth behind it. Darby Slick wrote the track in the aftermath of a bad breakup in that hippie scene, and what he was coming to see was the undercurrent of how the free love hippie era didn't exactly always work for everybody. That's one of the reasons why Grace Slick's furious intensity connected so damn well for me. The sort of psychedelic subversion that showed the very real human consequences beneath all the flower power. From the anger curdling below the surface to the friends that are so disconnected to the seething rage range that's on the verge of breaking out. Hell, it's not hard to see the hook as a sarcastic taunt, because it's kind of clear that the you in this story clearly has some growing up to do before he finds somebody to love and then lose again. Now granted, the subtext just surrounded a great goddamn song with a sharp main guitar line, a fantastic hook, playing a lot of minor tones with a terrific groove, driving that fiery delivery and very welcome harmony. This is psychedelic rock that is smart enough to take the piss out of its own scene and its own genre, and Jefferson Airplane, they netted themselves another classic song. If you haven't heard it, somehow, check it out. Number 2. So we're down to the final few songs on this list, and I'm sure fans are noting a very conspicuous absence. A band that was emblematic of the 1960s and that critics have characterized as one of the greatest of all time. Well, it's not like I disagree or something.
Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. There beneath the blue suburban skies, I sit and meanwhile back.
At this point, what is there for me even to say about the Beatles? Seriously, there are music historians have dedicated their entire careers to this band. They have in-depth Wikipedia articles for nearly every single song they made. Their legacy has been so thoroughly picked over that I'm genuinely not sure I could add much to this. I will say I was surprised to see so few Beatles songs on the year-end Hot 100 in 1967, given their dominance in pop culture and everybody trying to rip them off, both coming off of the Magical Mystery Tour project. But I couldn't leave Penny Lane off this list. The subtle key shifts, the eclectic mix of arranged instrumentation and horns that were actually doing weird things, the precocious Britishness of it all that careens wonderfully off the surrealism of the picture. Sure, it's silly, but in the way that recalls the glory days of Monty Python's Flying Circus, which would get its start just 2 years later. And yet, despite the hidden raunchiness of a fish and finger pie indeed, it recalls Paul McCartney's perfect balance between the absurd and genuinely wistful. An attempt to recapture the scenes of his childhood and then one-up John's tribute in Strawberry Fields Forever, a song that would have easily made this list had it actually charted. But with this as one of the Beatles' best ever songs, what could have possibly been better than this? Well, before we get that answer, we have our honorable mentions, and there'll be a few more of them than before because, come on, it's 1967.
When you find that you love the future be hard, but when you gotta do that love you don't take care of, then you better beware of the happening.
So it's unquestioned that the Supremes are one of the biggest acts, not just in the 1960s, but of all time. In 1967, it was a turbulent year for them indeed, with this being one of the final songs recorded with Florence Villard before she was replaced with Cindy Birdsong, and Diana Ross is further emphasized as the star of the group. Now, whether that was good or necessary, that's a matter of historical debate. Most of Motown's decisions in the 1960s would fall in that category. It was a crazy time. But that doesn't make The Happening any less of a fantastic song. It just careens into some strange territory in its composition with such casual aplomb. The horn arrangement and the darker guitar line almost imply something out of a James Bond movie, with the rest of the instrumentation showing that exuberance and the whirlwind fling that's happening. Emphasis on whirlwind. And yeah, it's a terrific song too.
Thank the Lord for the nighttime. Forget the day. Day of uptight time. Baby, chase it away. I get a relaxation. And it's the time to groove. Thank the Lord for the nighttime. Thank the Lord for you.
You know, Neil Diamond's career, at least his early years, kind of fascinate me because he was very much a figure behind the scenes for some time before becoming a breakout solo artist. Hell, he wrote one of the other better-known honorable mentions coming up on this list. Now, this was a little lesser known. It was a solo hit that just managed to scrape onto the bottom of the year-end list. The closing track to his second album that was pretty solid, that brought a much thicker country rock twang to its guitar, even as it really had to play the more of the pop conventions of the time. And thus, while that riff is easily why I like it so much, the lyrics deserve some scrutiny as well, as in the 1960s, he was literally being worked to the bone as a songwriter during the day, and even if it was just framed as a love song, some of the pathos rings through regardless. Great little song, definitely overlooked in his discography, definitely worth a listen.
At long last, love has arrived, and I thank God I'm alive. You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off you.
Okay, look, Frankie Valli is a bit of a tough character for me to like. His voice is an acquired taste at best, and while he was incredibly successful in the 1960s with the Four Seasons, the sound has not exactly always aged well, especially for me, and especially in comparison with the majority of songs on this list. That being said, Can't Take My Eyes Off You was one of his biggest hits for a reason, with some of the great understated swing before transitioning into a much bigger, much more impressive arrangement with all those horns, and that's even before we get the key change, and that just comes at the right time. And yeah, at this point, over 50 years later, it's almost ubiquitous in pop culture, but with a song this good, kind of okay with it.
What you want, baby, I got it. What you need, you know I got it. All I'm asking is for a little respect when you come home. Just a little bit, hey, baby, just a little bit. When you get home, just a little bit, mister, just a little bit.
Alright, look, if we're looking for a year that really put Aretha Franklin on this list, it was 1967, with this being her first #1 hit after signing to Atlantic. And it was arguably the one I liked the most that she put out this year. Not just because she took Otis Redding's original composition in a more strident and fiery direction, but again, it's a track that has almost become ingrained in the bedrock of modern popular culture. So praising it, kind of redundant, but Aretha Franklin, she's such a powerhouse behind the microphone. The piano-backed rhythm is terrific. I love the horn interlude that most people seem to actually forget even happens, and the lyrics are a fantastic recontextualization from what Otis Redding wrote in the original. But really, saying all this, you already knew it. The song's great. So here's something controversial. I'm a lot colder on the Doors than many critics both then and now, and I'm not sure an honorable mention on this list is the best place to expand on why, especially considering that it would involve a deep dive into several of their albums that I have issues with. And yet, I get why Light My Fire was so damn huge. It was the song that got them banned from the Ed Sullivan Show. Jim Morrison's charismatic baritone was genuinely impressive, and he had the rawness to back it up when he needed it. And the single edit with that central organ riff, it is truly great. Now, at the same time, I've heard the full version. I'm not all crazy about the extended solos, and the writing of the song falls in a bit of a weird spot emotionally for me. Not missing the emotional note, but playing it in a way that you might understand why the woman is a little hesitant to light that fire and come out of the mire. Still, the organ line, vocal delivery, it's enough. At least for this list.
Reflections of the way life used to be. Reflections of the love it took from me. I'm all alone now, no love to shield me. Trapped in a world that's a distorted reality.
So this was the other big single for the Supremes, recorded with Florence Ballard, but released after she was replaced. And it was also the point where the Supremes started to get a little bit weird. It was one of the first ever examples of synthesizers on a major pop record, to say nothing of soul. And those popping tones playing off the organ line and the tambourine before diving into more psychedelic textures and composition not only fits the lyrics of being trapped in the mirrored memories of one's own mind, but also showed a direction for soul that really hadn't been explored much in this way, especially not in the mainstream. Now, it wasn't a direction the Supremes would really pursue much more deeply on later projects, but you know what? For a brief moment coming out of the Summer of Love, this clicked. An oddity among some of their great songs, but worth it, really, all the same.
Then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. Not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in the road. I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried.
Okay, yeah, most of you know this song because of Smash Mouth and Shrek. But you know what? If it wasn't for Neil Diamond writing the original for the Monkees, arguably one of their best songs and narrowly beating out Daydream Believer for this list, you wouldn't have such a great meme now, would you? And while the Monkees never got a ton of respect, pretty much ever, and going back through some of their singles, and they had a lot this year, you can get why, between the thin vocals and the cheap arrangements and an era opposite the Beatles. I'm a believer, it remains a standout, even remembered to this day. And I gotta respect that.
If you wanted the stars, I would ride across the sky and lay
So this was the biggest song of 1967, and the story of how it got to that point is utterly strange, partially linked to it being associated with a British film of the same name that might have been branded as kind of sentimental at the time, but it ultimately lasted as an understated picture of race relations and an excellent lead performance from Sidney Poitier. And as such, the song is kind of on the nose if you've seen the movie, and when it was used in the first season of Glee at the finale, it also felt a little bit too direct, but at the same time, the poignancy of the verses play into a tremendous hook, and I genuinely love the more brittle strings and bass that has always served as the most recognizable emotional motif. Yeah, kind of saccharine, but it earns it.
I think we're alone now. There doesn't seem to be anyone around. I think we're alone now. The beating of our hearts is the only sound.
Again, more of you knows this more because of Tiffanys' cover in 1987, but the original has a terrific bass line and plays to a rougher palette with a seedier keyboard and conspiratorial exuberance. It's markedly different than the Tiffany version, which, yeah, probably is a little better, but when the foundation point is such a great pop song, I'm just not gonna complain. And this is just an awesome soul song. Great lead guitar lines, sweet trumpet, and phenomenal interplay between Sam and Dave. Another criminally overlooked duo in the annals of a lot of music history. And yet, most people didn't recognize the political context of this song either. After the 12th Street riots in Detroit, songwriter Isaac Hayes, yeah, the guy who co-wrote a disturbing number of amazing songs, including the theme from Shaft, and would later be known by more of you as Chef from South Park, he noticed that certain buildings in Detroit hadn't been burned and they were marked with the word soul. And through that contextualization in this song, he basically smuggled a Black Power anthem onto the radio in 1967 that became a critically acclaimed classic. So yeah, there was that. Okay, that was a lot of phenomenal music. What could be better? Number 1. At the end of the day, what was going to be my number 1 came down between this and Penny Lane, one of my all-time favorite Beatles songs. And yet, it was up against what might be one of my favorite songs of all time, regardless of band. One of my favorite groups of all time. A song that might not have been the first breakthrough for this act, although it was their highest charting hit in the United States, but it probably deserved to be. And thus...
I can see for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. Oh yeah.
Can you hear it? That riff bringing a classic rock edge that would characterize new genres of music to come. The tension that is just perfectly captured in Roger Daltrey's vocals and the overdubbed harmonies that twist in all sorts of random interesting directions. The comeuppance song in the face of cheating to rule them all, characterized by the protagonist's 1,000-mile stare. The percussion was dense, the grinding grooves and solo were note perfect, a sort of lean, nasty, hard rock tune that was The Who at their absolute best. One of the heaviest tracks to be written at that time, and maybe even inspired Paul McCartney to write Helter Skelter in order to best it. Music writer Stephen Hyden, writing about Led Zeppelin, coined the term the sound to describe the primal core of production mastery that ensured that the music never sounded dated. Well, you know what? The Who beat him to it. A classic rock classic that remains as foundational to the genre as any other song. And thus, understandably, unquestionably for me, the best hit song of 1967, and the years to follow, few would ever come close to topping it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know that this list might be a little controversial, so what you thought, put your links in the description below. I'd be happy to hear your comments. And yeah, if you guys want to get involved in my schedule and potentially add more top 10s to the list, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list if you're in the higher contributors. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.